Imagine a world where kings didn't just punish rebellion, they enjoyed it, where the screams of servants echoed through marble halls, not as justice, but as music. Monarchs hosted banquets beside execution scaffolds, sipping wine as bodies were torn apart. Disobedience wasn't silenced, it was performed. Skin flayed for amusement, tongues torn out mid-speech, and servants forced to smile through agony while their masters applauded. These weren't acts of madness, they were tradition. Behind every golden throne lay a stage of horror, because in the age of absolute power, loyalty was survival, and pain was entertainment. Imagine waking up to the sound of boots marching toward your door. You've served the royal court for years, bowing, cleaning, delivering messages, keeping secrets you were never supposed to know. But today, one whisper, one suspicion, one small act that displeased the crown has sealed your fate. From this moment on, your life belongs entirely to the wrath of a monarch. There are no trials, no appeals, no mercy, only judgment, swift, brutal, and absolute. In the age of monarchs, loyalty wasn't a virtue, it was survival. The king or queen wasn't just a ruler, they were divine authority made flesh. Their will was law, their anger was execution. For royal servants, even the smallest mistake could be interpreted as rebellion. A poorly timed glance, a delayed bow, or a rumor of dissent could spark deadly consequences. Because in the eyes of absolute power, disobedience wasn't merely a crime. It was betrayal of the entire order, an act of treason against God's chosen sovereign. The royal courts of Europe, the East, and beyond were built not only on luxury, but on fear. Behind the gold and marble were dungeons hidden beneath castles where servants vanished without explanation. Some never even made it to the dungeon. Their punishment began the moment they were accused. Guards dragged them by chains through the corridors they once swept. Fellow servants watched in silence, afraid to even blink too long, because sympathy could look a lot like complicity. Royal wrath was never impulsive, it was theatrical. Monarchs used fear as policy. Every punishment had an audience. Every execution was a warning. The message was clear. Those who defy the crown will not simply die. They will demonstrate what disobedience costs. That's why servants weren't merely punished. They were made examples of. Some were stripped of their names, their families forced to watch as their loyalty was questioned and their dignity destroyed. Others were branded with hot irons bearing the royal seal, marking them as traitors for life, if they lived long enough to carry the scar. In many royal courts, torture wasn't considered cruelty, it was procedure. Monarchs believed pain revealed truth, that a broken body would produce an honest confession. Ironically, those who confessed under torture were often executed anyway. Servants were tied to interrogation racks, their limbs stretched until their joints tore apart. Some were suspended by ropes for hours, their toes barely touching the ground. Others were locked in iron maidens, brutal devices lined with spikes, their screams echoing through castle walls designed to muffle mercy. But the worst torture wasn't always physical. The psychological torment was precise, personal, and devastating. Servants accused of betrayal were often kept in darkness for days, deprived of food, light, and human contact. Their minds slowly unraveled. Some begged for death long before the executioner arrived. Letters from the 16th century describe prisoners who confessed to crimes they couldn't have committed just to end the silence. The monarchs didn't care if the confession was true. They only cared that it was public. This wasn't madness, it was strategy. Fear maintained order better than loyalty ever could. A loyal servant might question, but a terrified one would obey without thought. Monarchs understood this balance intimately. They used torture not only to punish the guilty but to discipline the innocent. The palace had to function like a living organism, every heartbeat synchronized to the will of the ruler. The price of disloyalty wasn't just death, it was the destruction of identity itself. History remembers the names of kings and queens, but behind every throne lay hundreds of servants who vanished in silence. A chambermaid who overheard the wrong conversation, a guard who hesitated to draw his sword, a messenger who delayed a letter by 1 hour. Their disappearances were never documented, their families were silenced with coin or threat. And yet, whispers of their fates spread like ghost stories among the living, stories meant to keep everyone else in line. The chilling irony is that some monarchs didn't merely order torture, they enjoyed it. Records from royal courts in France, England, and the Ottoman Empire reveal rulers who attended executions as if they were banquets. The screams were background music to their authority. To them, fear was art, and each punishment was a masterpiece meant to sustain power. Even the executioners were treated like instruments of divine justice, not killers. They were the hand of the crown, and the crown never trembled. So imagine standing there, surrounded by guards, your head forced down as the royal decree is read aloud. You're accused of disloyalty, maybe for whispering doubt, maybe for hesitating to kneel. The monarch doesn't need evidence. Their suspicion is enough. You beg, you swear your loyalty, but your words are meaningless, because in that moment you are not human. You are a symbol, a warning to others. The royal audience watches as you're dragged away, and they all understand next time it could be them. Every empire that ruled through fear believed it would last forever. None did. But what remains, across centuries, is the same ancient lesson. Power feeds on obedience, and once obedience turns to fear, cruelty becomes routine. In the royal courts, the price of disloyalty wasn't paid with blood alone. It was paid with memory, erased from history so that others could live in silence. Even today, the shadows of those dungeons linger, not in stone walls or iron chains, but in systems where power demands submission, where defiance is still punished, and where fear still enforces loyalty. Because while the crowns have fallen and the swords have rusted, the psychology of tyranny remains timeless. The horrifying tortures of the past were meant to destroy the body, but their true purpose was much darker: to remind the world that those who challenge power, no matter how small, will always be made to suffer. And that's the real horror of royal justice. It didn't end with the executioner's blade. It survived in silence, in the fear of speaking, in the obedience that endures long after the tyrant is gone. The servants may have died, but the message lived on. The crown, no matter who wore it, always made sure of that. Before the whips, before the blade, before the executioner even lifted a finger, came the silence. That was the first stage of royal punishment. For disobedient servants, torture did not begin with blood. It began with absence of light, of sound, of human touch. Kings and queens understood something terrifying. You could break a person's body in hours, but to break their will required patience and precision. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to erase. In many royal courts, dungeons weren't the pits of screaming agony we imagine. They were tombs for the living. Servants accused of betrayal were often locked away in cells barely larger than coffins, where they couldn't stand upright or stretch their limbs. Guards were ordered not to speak, not to acknowledge the prisoners at all. The silence itself became a weapon. Within days, the mind began to unravel. Some prisoners clawed the walls until their nails tore off. Others whispered to themselves, begging to hear a voice, any voice, even that of their captor. One account from the 1500s describes a royal cook accused of poisoning a noble's meal. He was placed in a dark chamber beneath the castle kitchens, where the air reeked of mold and grease. For 40 days he was fed only scraps of rotten bread. No one spoke to him. When he was finally brought before the monarch, he was unable to form words. His mind had collapsed into silence, the perfect confession for a ruler who demanded guilt, not truth. Psychological torture was not about spectacle. It was about control. Monarchs wanted their servants to fear what might happen, not just what did. That anticipation, the endless waiting for punishment, was its own form of torment. Many prisoners were told they'd be executed at dawn, only to have the order delayed for weeks. Each night, they waited for the sound of footsteps that never came. That uncertainty hollowed them out far more effectively than pain ever could. Some rulers went further. They used light and sound as weapons. Prisoners were locked in rooms with torches burning day and night, never allowing their eyes to rest. Others were chained in echo chambers where dripping water tormented them endlessly. In one English court, disobedient scribes were forced to transcribe royal decrees while kneeling for hours, every mistake punished by removing a fingernail. Their screams weren't meant to be heard by the court. They were meant to echo through the servants' quarters as warning. Isolation wasn't just punishment. It was training. Servants who survived it often returned broken, obedient, and loyal beyond reason. Monarchs understood this transformation. Once a man had been silenced, he would do anything to avoid returning to that void. Some were rewarded for their repentance and reinstated to their duties, proof to the others that loyalty could be rebuilt through suffering. But the truth was, these survivors were no longer men, they were echoes, shells molded by fear. There were also the cruel experiments, methods so inventive they bordered on psychological theater. In France, rebellious attendants were blindfolded and made to serve invisible monarchs, forced to kneel before empty thrones, apologize to silence, and pour wine for no one. It was humiliation as ritual, meant to make the servant question their very sense of reality. The court would watch in amusement as the punished bowed to nothing, trembling under the weight of invisible authority. In Eastern courts, punishment often took the form of sensory deprivation disguised as mercy. A disloyal eunuch might be banished not to death, but to a soundless chamber where his meals were passed through a small slit in the wall. No words, no faces, no light. Some lasted months. Others began mutilating themselves, the only remaining act of control they possessed. The monarchs didn't need to witness the agony. They only needed to know it existed, tucked neatly beneath the palace, out of sight but never out of mind. There was a deeper psychology to it all, the calculated dismantling of human identity. Servants were stripped of their names, referred to only by numbers or crimes. Documents from medieval courts show prisoners labeled simply the disloyal one, the thief of trust, the whisperer. These weren't descriptions, they were replacements for identity, because once a person lost their name, they lost their place in the world. They became property again, body and soul. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how these methods became normalized. Torture chambers weren't secret in most royal castles, they were architectural necessities. Every monarch inherited not just the throne, but the tools to maintain it. And among those tools, alongside the crown, the sword, the seal, was the dungeon. It was the engine of obedience. Some kings even toured their prisons like galleries, admiring the craftsmanship of the devices that kept them in power. To many rulers, psychological torture was more elegant than execution. Death was final. It silenced the subject, yes, but it also freed them. Breaking the mind ensured eternal servitude, even in life. That's why so many royal servants disappeared, not through death, but through transformation. They returned quieter, colder, emotionless, living reminders that rebellion was not met with fire and blood, but with something far worse, forgetting who you are. One Spanish historian described the room of reflection, a small square chamber used by a 17th century queen to punish gossiping attendants. Servants were left alone inside with a single mirror, forced to stare at themselves for days, while voices whispered accusations through hidden slits in the walls. The queen called it a lesson in loyalty. Most left the room sobbing, swearing allegiance. A few never spoke again. It was not madness, it was policy. Monarchs understood what modern psychologists later confirmed. Prolonged isolation can dismantle the human psyche. The mind begins to invent voices, memories, confessions. The body starts to betray itself. In that fragile state, the servant no longer fears death. They fear consciousness itself. And that was the genius of royal cruelty. Pain was visible, measurable, even forgivable. But the mind could be destroyed quietly. No blood, no spectacle, just the slow unmaking of a human being. The perfect crime of power. But isolation was often just the beginning. The truly inventive cruelty awaited those who spoke out, those who dared to question the hand that ruled them. For in royal courts, silence was not survival. It was only the first act of a much darker theater of pain. In the world of monarchs, punishment was never just about ending a life. It was about making that end unforgettable. The death of a rebellious servant had to mean something, not just for the victim, but for everyone watching. Executions weren't private matters of justice. They were performances, calculated, staged, and executed with one purpose, to remind the people that the crown's power was not to be questioned. Royal courts perfected this art of terror. When a servant defied the monarch, their punishment became an event. Notices were spread, crowds gathered, and executioners prepared the stage. The goal wasn't efficiency, it was fear. Death had to be slow, deliberate, and symbolic. Every scream, every drop of blood was meant to echo through the minds of those who might ever consider disobedience. The first part of the performance was humiliation. The condemned was paraded through the streets, dressed in rags, sometimes with signs hung around their neck describing their crime. People jeered, spat, and threw stones, not always out of cruelty, but survival. To show sympathy was to share the same fate. This public degradation was the monarch's first strike, reducing the accused from servant to spectacle before the real punishment began. Then came the display of suffering. Across Europe, the most feared execution was drawing and quartering, a punishment reserved for those accused of betraying the crown. The condemned was tied to horses that pulled in opposite directions, tearing the body apart piece by piece. But before that horror, the victim was often half-hanged, brought to the brink of death, revived, and then dismembered alive. Each act was methodical. Each was a message: defy the throne, and your body will be used as a lesson. In England, such punishments were treated almost like festivals. Crowds brought their children to watch. Vendors sold food. The church would bless the proceedings. This was monarchy distilled into ritual, the fusion of faith, fear, and authority. The king's justice wasn't only in the execution, it was in the participation of the people. Every cheer, every gasp, was a small contribution to the machinery of control. Beheading, by comparison, was seen as merciful, a noble form of death reserved for higher-ranking traitors. But even that was rarely clean. The executioner's axe missed as often as it struck true. Some victims endured multiple blows before death finally arrived. Mary, Queen of Scots, famously required 3 strikes. Each swing was followed by murmurs of horror and fascination. Emotions the crown exploited with precision. The pain wasn't just the condemned's to feel. It was the public's to remember. Monarchs understood that terror loses its edge if it remains hidden. That's why executions were held in open squares, near markets, or in front of castles. They wanted every scream to embed itself in the city's memory. Servants were sometimes forced to attend, standing in formation as their former colleague met their end. It was a psychological order: watch and understand what happens when loyalty falters. Some fainted, others wept silently. All learned the same lesson. One particularly haunting example comes from 16th century France, where a royal messenger accused of conspiring with foreign powers was condemned to be flayed alive. His punishment took place in a public square. The king watched from a balcony as the executioner peeled the skin from his limbs. The crowd's reaction, horror mixed with fascination, was precisely what the monarch intended. It was more than retribution. It was theater. The executioner played his role, the audience theirs, and the king remained the author of the scene. In Spain and parts of Eastern Europe, burning was a favorite method, not because it was quick, but because it was visible. Flames could be seen for miles. A servant who betrayed their ruler would be tied to a stake, surrounded by kindling soaked in oil. The fire was lit slowly, often from the feet upward, allowing onlookers to witness every second. Some monarchs ordered musicians to play during the execution, drowning screams with celebration, turning agony into ceremony, but not all spectacles were bloody. Some were symbolic, just as cruel, but quieter. A rebellious servant might be forced to wear an iron mask shaped like an animal, paraded before the court as the beast who defied his master. Others were locked in iron cages and hung from castle walls until death claimed them naturally. The body remained on display for days, a decaying reminder that loyalty was not a choice, but a law of survival. The psychological toll on the onlookers was immense. Royal advisors documented how crowds left these events pale, trembling, and silent. Parents warned their children, "Obey, or this could be you." Even the executioners bore scars. Many drank heavily, haunted by the eyes of the dying, but their pain was irrelevant. In royal politics, emotion was weakness. The only feeling that mattered was fear, and it had to last long after the blood was washed away. Some monarchs took it further, preserving parts of their victims as trophies. Heads were mounted on spikes along castle walls. Hands and tongues of traitors were displayed in markets. The message was simple and effective: disloyalty doesn't end with death, it continues in humiliation. The dead were stripped of dignity, their remains used as tools of propaganda. In many cases, the families were forbidden to bury them, forcing loved ones to watch as the body decomposed in public view. Every act of punishment was a lesson in power. The monarchy didn't just want obedience, it wanted submission born from horror. The servant who witnessed such brutality would carry that fear into every action, every word, every breath. It turned subjects into self-policing tools of the regime. When fear becomes tradition, control becomes effortless. And yet, beneath the spectacle, there was something deeply revealing: a ruler's insecurity. The louder the punishment, the weaker the throne. Only those who fear rebellion need to prove their power through cruelty. That's why the history of royal executions is also a history of paranoia. Kings and queens destroying their own humanity to preserve their illusion of divinity. For the condemned servant, there was no redemption. Their final moments were public property. Their agony became entertainment, their death a warning, their body a message. For the survivors, those who watched, those who obeyed, it was a lifelong scar. Because once you've seen what power can do to a body, you never forget. You don't question again. You bow lower, speak softer, and hope the crown never turns its gaze on you. That was the true purpose of public punishment. Not justice, not order, but psychological warfare. A method perfected by monarchs who understood that fear doesn't just keep the guilty silent, it keeps everyone silent. And in the end, that silence was their greatest weapon. In every royal court, rebellion wasn't always grand. Sometimes it began with a whisper, a hidden letter, or a look of hesitation. But to a ruler who believed themselves divine, even hesitation was treason. The crown demanded not loyalty, but devotion. And the moment that devotion cracked, the punishment became legendary. The first story belongs to Thomas Hensley, a royal messenger in 15th century England. His crime? Delivering a sealed letter meant for the Queen, but keeping a copy for himself. What he read inside was a secret treaty, proof that the king was paying mercenaries to crush a rebellion he'd publicly claimed to pardon. Hensley thought he was protecting the realm by exposing corruption. In truth, he had signed his own death warrant. When the betrayal was discovered, the king didn't execute him immediately. Instead, he ordered a demonstration. Hensley was stripped naked and paraded through the castle courtyard, forced to kneel at every corner while heralds shouted, "Behold the tongue that betrayed the crown." Then the royal torturer took over. His punishment was to have his tongue cut out. Not in private, but during a royal banquet. The courtiers dined as he screamed. His body was hung from the castle gate for 3 days. His silence now the perfect message: truth has no voice against the throne. Another case, even darker, unfolded in the Ottoman court of Sultan Murad IV. His servant, Kara Emin, was known for his loyalty, until one night he was caught warning another attendant about the Sultan's secret executions. Murad ordered a punishment that would erase him, not only from life, but from memory. Kara Emin was bound inside a barrel studded with inward-facing spikes. The barrel was rolled slowly through the palace garden as the Sultan watched from his balcony. When the motion stopped, the spikes ensured that every breath tore new flesh. Murad called it the Wheel of Silence. The next morning, the barrel was displayed at the city gates. Inside, there was no face left to recognize. In France, a royal handmaiden named Madeleine de Vaucluse committed an act of quiet defiance that still chills historians. She was accused of stealing the queen's ring, a false charge planted by jealous nobles. When interrogated, she refused to confess. For the monarch, defiance from a woman, and worse, a servant, was intolerable. The queen ordered a punishment meant not only to destroy her but to make her a lesson in obedience. Madeleine was forced to stand before the court wearing a heated iron collar inscribed with the words, "Je me tais," I am silent. The collar was never removed. She survived 3 days before infection took her. Her body was buried in unmarked soil, but the collar was hung in the servants' quarters for decades, a warning that silence was the only virtue the crown required. Across these kingdoms, the method changed, but the message remained the same. Treason wasn't defined by action, but by perception. A servant didn't need to betray the monarch, they only needed to be suspected of it. Royal paranoia was its own kind of sickness, and it demanded sacrifices to stay alive. One of the most infamous examples comes from the Russian court of Ivan the Terrible. His stable master, Nikita Andreev, was a quiet man who had served faithfully for years. But one night, Ivan's prized horse fell ill. Andreev was accused of poisoning the animal, an absurd charge, but in the Tsar's eyes, a personal insult. Ivan ordered a punishment so grotesque it defied reason. Andreev was sewn inside the carcass of the dead horse, alive, with only his face exposed. He was left in the royal courtyard for 2 days, forced to rot alongside the animal he was accused of killing. When he finally died, Ivan remarked, "Now they ride together in the afterlife." The power behind these punishments wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Each act was a calculated performance designed to implant terror. Servants, soldiers, even nobles watched and learned. Disobedience didn't just lead to death, it led to degradation. You didn't merely lose your life, you lost your identity, your dignity, your name. The monarchy's greatest strength was not the sword, but the spectacle. A single execution could control hundreds of subjects for years. Fear became the currency of obedience. Servants whispered about what they'd seen, passing horror from one generation to the next. The memory of the tortured was more effective than any guard. Behind the curtain of royal grandeur, there existed a world where loyalty had no reward and suspicion had no defense. Servants lived in constant dread of royal moods. One glance, one rumor, one unlucky coincidence could turn devotion into a death sentence. The courts were not halls of glory. They were stages of control, where every act of cruelty reinforced the illusion of divine power. These stories, Hensley, Kara Eamon, Madeline, Andreev, are not isolated acts of madness. They are evidence of a system built on fear, a system where human beings became instruments of demonstration. Their pain wasn't private, it was political. Every cry, every mutilation was a message to the living: the crown does not forgive. Even today, historians reading royal records notice how meticulously these punishments were documented. Dates, witnesses, the precise tools used. It wasn't savagery without order, it was order through savagery. Kings and queens believed that terror, properly managed, maintained peace. The court chroniclers called it justice. The victims called it mercy delayed. The psychology behind such punishment is simple and horrifying. The monarch must always be feared more than loved. Love fades. Fear controls, and so every disloyal servant became a tool to remind the court who truly ruled, not through compassion, not through wisdom, but through dominance carved into flesh. In the end, every royal dynasty that thrived on cruelty eventually fell, not because of rebellion, but because fear consumes its master too. The monarch who trusts no one dies surrounded by silence, but for the servants, their screams outlasted the crowns that killed them. Their suffering remains the unspoken truth behind royal power, that loyalty built on terror is never loyalty at all, only survival. Power alone wasn't enough for some rulers. They needed to feel it, to see it, hear it, and enjoy it. In the darkest corners of royal history, torture wasn't simply a method of control or punishment. It was entertainment. Monarchs who ruled over thousands found their greatest pleasure in the suffering of a few. The pain of servants, courtiers, and prisoners became their private theater, a stage where agony was art and cruelty was applause. In several medieval and early modern courts, executions were not administrative duties, they were invitations. Noble families were summoned to watch. Seats were arranged. Wine was poured. The condemned was brought out like an actor before a bloodthirsty audience. Some kings even delayed punishments until festivals, ensuring the spectacle would draw maximum attention. The message was always the same: the crown doesn't just command life and death, it enjoys it. King Charles IX of France, for instance, famously turned the torture of supposed traitors into court amusement during the 1570s. Servants accused of treasonous gossip were tied to poles in the royal courtyard while the young king and his guests observed. The courtiers placed bets on how long each victim would last before fainting. According to witnesses, the king laughed as blood splattered the marble floors. He didn't order the cruelty out of rage, he ordered it out of boredom. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Ibrahim, later called the Mad, orchestrated similar scenes. Disobedient attendants were wrapped in oil-soaked cloth and set alight as the sultan watched from his balcony, sipping sherbet. He reportedly referred to the burning as the dance of devotion. These events weren't secret. They were deliberate statements of dominance. The ruler wanted everyone to understand that pain itself was his plaything. Even monarchs famed for sophistication had their darker appetites. In the Renaissance courts of Italy, nobles were known to attend masked balls where mock executions were performed for entertainment. But the twist? Sometimes, the executions weren't mock at all. Servants accused of theft or insolence were brought in as part of the show. As the guests clapped to the rhythm of harpsichords, the executioner carried out real punishments: hands severed, tongues cut out, bodies thrown aside, all under the glow of candlelight. In England, King Henry VIII took personal satisfaction in watching executions from the windows of his palace. He didn't need to be there, but he chose to be. He invited foreign ambassadors to witness beheadings as demonstrations of royal justice. One chronicler recorded him smiling as Anne Boleyn's head fell, remarking that the axe was swift and noble. But not all executions were that quick. Henry often ordered lesser traitors to suffer slowly, sometimes watching for hours, feasting as their screams carried across the courtyard. For him, terror was not merely policy. It was pleasure. Some monarchs went further, turning torture into literal theater. In the Russian court of Peter the Great, servants accused of conspiracy were forced to perform mock trials in costume. They were made to act out their own guilt before their execution. Peter designed the scenes himself, dictating lines of humiliation and laughter. Afterward, the real punishment began: floggings, mutilations, or hanging by the ribs on iron hooks. Witnesses said Peter often watched in silence, only breaking it with applause. In France, during the reign of Louis II, prisoners were sometimes placed in iron cages known as filets du roi, the king's little girls. These cages were displayed near his residence so that the monarch could observe the prisoner's slow decay over weeks. He referred to the sight as a study in patience. Some courtiers described his fascination not as sadism, but as curiosity, as though he were studying insects pinned beneath glass. That cold detachment, historians note, made him even more terrifying. What made this horror uniquely royal was its ritualistic precision. Every act of pain had ceremony. Servants were sometimes forced to kneel and recite oaths of loyalty while being tortured. Executioners bowed to the monarch before each strike. Drums rolled, trumpets played, and courtiers toasted the ruler's divine justice. This blending of ceremony and cruelty blurred the line between governance and spectacle. It wasn't chaos, it was theater. The victims weren't always rebels. Sometimes they were entertainers themselves, jesters, musicians, or servants who made a wrong joke at the wrong time. One record from Spain describes a court musician punished for singing a satirical song about the queen's temper. He was forced to play his lute while being beaten, each note marking another lash. When his fingers finally shattered, the monarch ordered the lute to be nailed above the throne as a warning. There were also the performative pardons, acts where rulers pretended to show mercy, only to revoke it moments later. A servant might be told his life was spared, allowed to smile, to breathe, and then, as he turned to thank the crown, the executioner's blade struck. The court erupted in laughter. Mercy, too, was entertainment. The cruelty wasn't just in killing, it was in giving hope first. Such scenes reveal the most disturbing truth about unchecked power. When a ruler becomes untouchable, empathy dies first. The human cost of fear becomes irrelevant. Torture turns from punishment into performance, from justice into joy. To the monarch, each scream is validation. Each death reaffirms their godlike control. It's not about the victim's crime, it's about the ruler's pleasure. Psychologists today describe this as authoritarian euphoria, a state where dominance becomes addictive. Monarchs didn't just need obedience, they needed proof of it, proof written in agony. By witnessing suffering, they reassured themselves that their rule was absolute. The greater the pain, the greater their sense of control. It wasn't enough to rule bodies. They had to own souls. The horrifying part? These spectacles were applauded. Courtiers flattered cruelty, calling it divine justice. Priests blessed the killings. Artists painted them as symbols of order. The entire system conspired to turn horror into holiness. The monarch's pleasure became the empire's morality. Those who refused to watch were labeled traitors. Those who cried were silenced. Over time, the line between justice and entertainment dissolved completely. The screams of servants, slaves, and subjects became part of courtly life, as routine as music or prayer. Power had devoured empathy, and cruelty had become culture. When a ruler finds joy in suffering, society rots from the top down. That's the legacy of royal cruelty, not just death, but decay. It taught generations that fear maintains order, that pain keeps loyalty alive. And though thrones have fallen and crowns have turned to dust, the psychology of such power remains. Because when cruelty becomes celebration, humanity itself begins to rot. And even centuries later, the echoes of those royal screams still haunt the idea of power. A chilling reminder that for some rulers, suffering was never punishment. It was pleasure. The royal dungeons are gone, the iron cages rusted, the execution squares paved over. Yet the system that built them still lives on, rebranded and refined. The world no longer crowns kings, but it still worships power. The methods of punishment have evolved from visible blood to invisible control. Today, obedience is extracted not with whips or flames, but with fear, shame, and silence. The throne has changed, but the psychology behind it has not. Throughout history, monarchs understood one truth that modern rulers, corporations, and institutions still exploit. Fear is the most efficient form of governance. You don't need to chain people if they chain themselves. You don't need to torture bodies if you can dominate minds. Modern society calls it discipline, order, or policy, but the mechanism is identical: control through consequence. Those who speak against authority still risk punishment. Only now it comes in forms the world accepts: social destruction, financial ruin, exile, cancellation, or quiet disappearance. The same ancient dynamic persists. The powerful decide what loyalty means, and the rest learn to perform it. The palace has become the boardroom, the political office, or the digital platform. The courtiers now wear suits and smiles instead of silk and armor. And the servants? They are the citizens, the workers, the users, constantly reminded that stepping out of line carries a price. Public execution has become public humiliation, streamed to millions. Instead of gallows, there are headlines. Instead of iron collars, there are algorithms deciding who gets heard and who is buried in silence. It's easy to believe humanity outgrew tyranny, but the evidence says otherwise. Fear has simply become more sophisticated. In the medieval court, you feared the executioner. Today, you fear losing your reputation, your livelihood, your digital voice. Obedience has turned inward. The lash no longer strikes the skin, it strikes the conscience. The same fear that silenced servants in royal halls now silences whistleblowers, journalists, employees, and even ordinary people who dared to question those above them. History's royal punishments were designed to make examples, to ensure one man's suffering prevented 100 others from rebelling. That principle is everywhere today. A journalist imprisoned for exposing corruption, a worker fired for challenging their superiors, a citizen destroyed online for dissenting from the accepted narrative. Modern power doesn't need to draw blood when it can destroy credibility. The goal is still the same: keep the masses obedient, keep the illusion of order intact. The monarchy of old used dungeons and racks. The monarchy of now uses isolation, digital, social, psychological. When a person is exiled from their community, stripped of belonging, cut off from opportunity, the effect is no different than being locked underground centuries ago. Silence remains the most effective punishment. You can't revolt if no one hears your voice. You can't fight back if no one believes your story. Even in democracies, where freedom is celebrated, power finds ways to police behavior. The courts, the media, and the markets become new instruments of fear. Speak too loudly against authority, and the modern monarch, whether political, corporate, or cultural, reminds you who controls the spotlight. They no longer call it treason, they call it consequence. The echoes of royal cruelty also persist in global systems where workers are treated as disposable. In sweatshops, prisons, and military ranks, obedience is still extracted through fear. The same hierarchy exists: the ruler, the enforcer, the silent, and the punished. The faces have changed, the structure hasn't. Power still demands loyalty. Loyalty still demands submission, and submission still requires fear. Psychologically, this continuation of control has one purpose: to make resistance unthinkable. When people believe disobedience will destroy them, they stop dreaming of freedom altogether. That was the monarch's greatest victory, not the execution of rebels, but the extinction of rebellion itself. Today, that victory has been digitized. People censor themselves before power ever needs to intervene. The perfect servant of the modern age is not chained, he's compliant. Look closely at how history repeats itself. The royal court punished traitors to protect divine authority. Modern regimes punish dissidents to protect national security. Corporations punish leaks to protect intellectual property. The language changes, but the logic is identical. Anyone who threatens the hierarchy must be made an example. The spectacle of suffering, once public and physical, is now psychological and reputational, a different kind of execution, but an execution nonetheless. Even the concept of surveillance has its roots in royal paranoia. Monarchs once employed spies, informants, and loyal guards to uncover disloyalty. Now, surveillance is automated, omnipresent, and legal. Data replaces confession. Technology replaces torture. But the result is the same: submission through observation. When people know they are watched, they obey. When they believe their words are recorded, they stay silent. The illusion of progress hides a deeper truth. Humanity never abolished tyranny, it simply outsourced it. The instruments of fear became invisible, embedded in systems that claimed to protect us. The monarchs wore crowns. Today's rulers wear logos, flags, or digital anonymity. The servants still kneel. Only now, they do it voluntarily, because they've been convinced that obedience is safety. The human mind has not evolved past the fear of reprisal. It has merely adapted to new masters. Whether it's a king, a CEO, or a political elite, the dynamic remains timeless. Power demands silence, and those who resist pay the price. What once was done in the courtyard now happens in the comments section. What once ended with a blade now ends with ruin. And so, the ancient lesson survives, unchanged through centuries of civilization. Those who challenge entrenched power rarely win, but their suffering becomes the foundation of every freedom others later enjoy. The blood of the silent servants built the world's first laws. The courage of the executed rebels inspired revolutions. Every system of justice we claim today was forged from injustice. Yet even now, as history continues to repeat itself, humanity clings to the same hope, that the next generation will be the one to finally break free from the shadow of fear. Because while the tools of control have evolved, the warning remains exactly as it was whispered in the royal courts centuries ago. The price of defiance, especially against those who believe they are untouchable, is still unimaginably high. The torture chambers may have crumbled, but their message still breathes through time. Power survives by fear. The royal thrones have been replaced by offices, screens, and governments, yet the structure remains identical: obedience rewarded, defiance destroyed. Centuries ago, servants screamed under iron chains. Today, people are silenced through systems, shame, and control. Humanity may call itself civilized, but cruelty has simply evolved, trading swords for signatures and executions for erasure. The lesson carved in every tortured body still stands. Power demands silence, and the price of rebellion, whether in a dungeon or a boardroom, is still unbearable.